Cheers. I want everyone to do a little thought experiment and imagine you're a caterpillar. Indeed, imagine you're a very bright caterpillar, very reflective. And one day you're feeling a bit odd. There's something happening. You don't know what it is, but it's definitely strange. But because you're a bright and clever caterpillar, you think back and you think, well, I know I've learned three things in my life, so I'll apply these three principles to get me through this. What you've learned is stay as close to the ground as possible, move slowly, and be as inconspicuous as you can. And with that great knowledge, you then discover you've metamorphed into a highly colored butterfly flying through the air. That was not great preparation. And what I want to suggest is that coming out of this, we may be at one of those metamorphic moments in terms of the change. And I want to highlight four big things which I think are happening. The first is the impact in terms of the digital world. If you think of us doing this on Zoom, a year ago, we didn't even know what this was, right? So of course, there was some technology, but we weren't using it. We were all doing face-to-face. And just to give a kind of figure to indicate this change, when you talk about who's the largest organizations in the world, the traditional answers used to be NHS, Chinese Army, Indian Railways, and Walmart. But actually, the company that's grown fastest in terms of employees in the last year turns out to be Amazon. Amazon's now, as of last October, it was at 1.3 million employees worldwide, and Amazon will continue on that trajectory. It is a truly phenomenal, but no one could have anticipated that scale of change. And you've seen that in Amazon's share price. So we've had this digital change going on, and we don't know quite how dramatic that will be. Secondly, we've seen a very dramatic economic change. Last year, we had a 10% fall in GDP. That actually makes that really painful crisis of 2008, 2009 look like a walk in the park. So 10% down. And what's also happened with that is the people who've been affected weren't necessarily the people we would have expected to be affected. So people talk about the dramatic illustrations. I want to talk about hairdressers. If we could have everyone's Zoom picture up, we would know that one of the other things beyond going to swimming that lots of people are looking forward to next week is getting a haircut. Hairdressing was the classic counter-cyclical business, because never mind how poor you were, your hair grew at the same rate, so you still needed a haircut. Suddenly that whole sector has been decimated through this lockdown. Third is the scale of the social change. The estimate is that the population of London may have gone down by as much as 800,000. Interestingly, that's the same figure as the loss in population in New York as people have moved out. We have no idea at this point how this is going to settle down, but we've got this real challenge of how do you do social distance and live in an urban environment. I live in central London, and I would, in normal times, be using the Victoria line. The Victoria line runs at peak time about one train a minute. And when I get on, you normally have to queue 2 or 3 trains before you get on. There is no way you can have social distancing and a viable transport system simultaneously existing. So we've got that problem. And the fourth problem that we're facing is the scale of the fiscal challenge. every time the Chancellor makes an announcement, all we know is it's got so many notes on the end of it, we can't get our heads around it. So for those of us who've spent the last decade having to live in a world of austerity, we suddenly discover that the spend has been truly spectacular. But what we know is that that can't continue forever. The central banks had already used up a lot of their power so getting over the 2008-2009 crisis. So going forward, we're going to be in a very different fiscal world. So when you put these four things together, we really are in a very different world. So I want to give a suggestion of how we might start to look at this compared to what we traditionally do. And in leadership language, we sometimes talk about taming wicked issues, or we talk about leadership management and command. I want to follow a guy called Dave Snowden, a model called Sinophan, which kind of tries to break up the problems we face into four groups. The first is kind of clear problems where there is a best practice solution. If we were live at this point, I'd be asking everyone to put their hands up and say how many have ever assembled a piece of IKEA furniture. And the majority of people will put their hands up and say, yes, I've done that. Then ask a second question, how many of them did it successfully the first time round? And then you can find out who the liars are in the room, because 2 or 3 people put their hands down and pretend they did it successfully. Whereas everyone knows that you think you do what you're doing because you can't, the instructions are so weird, and you discover at the end you've got 3 screws which you don't know why you've got left over. All you do know is that IKEA weren't wasting their money; they were meant to be used. So what we know with these sorts of problems is there is a best practice model, and you follow it to that. You can have all your inspection regimes, enforcement regimes to do that sort of problem. Slightly further up the food chain, we have a lot of complicated problems, and this is where professions come in. And surgery is a good illustration of this. You need judgment. So we're in a world of good practice. And our third element is where we get chaotic fires and stuff like that. Now, if you've ever watched how firefighters are taught, the first thing that you aim to do is get the fire under control. So it's action, command structure, get it under control, and then start to deal with it. So your thing is to try and reduce the chaos. But when you get to this fourth area, which is when we get complex issues, like I think we are at this metamorphic moment, all those things which we have applied aren't successful because it's unclear what the impact of what you do will be, because there are unintended consequences of what happens. Put this around another way, and depending on your intellectual aspirations, you'll ascribe this either to Niels Bohr, the famous atomic physicist, or Yogi Berra, who was a baseball player, and that is predicting the future. Prediction is difficult, especially when it involves the future. So what we know is we don't know. And this is a really difficult space for leaders to be in. Standing on a platform saying, vote for me, I have no idea what to do, is rarely a winning ticket. Although, to be fair, for those of you who are fans of American 19th century history, there was indeed a party in the 1850s called the Know Nothing Party, which did reasonably well. And why it was called the Know Nothing Party was its supporters were told, if asked what were they up to, the answer was to say, I know nothing, and keep stum all the way through. So they got nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. But we're in this world where we have to admit that what will happen cannot be safely predicted. And therefore, you've got to operate in a very different way to what you would traditionally do, where you look for certainty, precision, etc. But what I think suggest the way out of this is to look at three other things. The first of which is, as a species, what we're pretty good at is, and what we do most of the time, is where we sense make rather than truth make. That's why we also do storytelling. And actually, it is likely that the origin of language comes out of gossip and storytelling rather than a desire to do nuclear physics. And the third key element coming out of this is sustaining. That's both personal sustaining and collective sustaining. Because when you have this level of complexity, what we need to be doing is quite a large amount of experimentation, i.e. admitting that if we knew what to do, we would have already done it. Now, what this is against is, instead of the 5-year plan or the great leader announcing the solution, actually coming back to Neil's point about lots of mayors, what we genuinely need is a whole variety of local experimentation to test how we might adapt to come out of this. And what that requires is a recognition that not everything will work, and not everything will work in the way in which we originally thought of it. As we are all now becoming medical experts as each day we discover what the risks are associated with particular drugs. The AstraZeneca one in particular, it seems to me to have been very unfairly treated, but never mind. But actually, a lot of this historically goes back to the great crisis with thalidomide, which turned out to be actually a killing disease. It was a truly disastrous drug in the way in which it was being used. So some in the audience might be surprised to know that thalidomide is still being used today, despite the dreadful harm that it did when it first came out. Because when it first came out, what we didn't know was that thalidomide was really dangerous for women who were pregnant. What we now know is that it actually is quite useful for treatment of certain cancers, particularly for old men. And to the best of scientific knowledge, we have not found any old men who've got pregnant. So we found a new use for it. So this is one of the other things which comes out of this, that things which were inappropriate a decade ago may now have a relevance. And so the solution that we need to get to is to be honest about our uncertainty. And what leaders are about is actually giving people the confidence to do these experiments, giving people the confidence to test and adapt, and giving them protection whilst doing that, rather than seeking blame and guilt. And it's a very significant switch through. And I think what we will see, as it always happens in these circumstances, is there will be places which get their act together, and there'll be other places which fall behind. And then we can bring in that once we've got this out of complexity into a complicated problem, we can then bring in the measures which say we'll roll out X to try and balance up. But the real risk will be if we sort of fall for the simplicity of a straightforward solution, the man with a plan approach, and say, back that. And having the confidence to recognize the limitations of the knowledge is the beginning of insight. And that's the switch which I think is going forward. And what we have to do is to recognize that there is quite a lot of physical exhaustion in the system and mental exhaustion because of the workload which people have had to take on. People have discovered that Zoom life can just be never ending. You can just, you clock on the hour and you go on to another Zoom call exactly afterwards. You don't even get the coffee break. And what we know when people are tired and exhausted is you fall back to what you already know. So the other thing that we have to do is actually build the time to enable people to recharge, to think differently. Because if we try and solve the problems of 2021 with the strategy of 2019, you can predict the outcome.
Okay, that is quite a big challenge, Joe. I mean, we heard from John McTernan a few weeks ago about how some of the private finance privatization and other things may have come to the end of their cycle. But you seem to be indicating that some of the precautionary principle will have to be challenged, that diversity around the country, of course, has been called postcode lottery for 30 years. So if there's diversions, you're going to be taking on quite a big challenge in that area. And restraining people from going for blame and guilt whenever the wheels come off on anything, that would certainly lead to a nervous breakdown in a large part of the media. So it strikes me that you have mapped out a very considerable challenge and something that puts leaders in a very challenging position. So our next contribution...
Can I just do one little flip back on postcode lottery, which is we used to have the audit commission, and I used to do the line that after 20 years of audit commission reports, it still rained more every year in Cumbria than it did in Cambridgeshire. And why hadn't we equalized rainfall across the country? It was one of these catastrophic failures of the audit commission that they allowed different rainfall. Now, of course, we accept there's a postcode, there's difference. Some people like living at the seaside, some people like living in the center of a town. I think one of the things that happened with that is, and it's a classic thing about the use of language, people should always confront the language back and actually go for what we want in a place is diversity. I mean, there's nothing more miserable in sin than going to a town that looks exactly like some other town. Have you ever been to somewhere and said, oh, I really like this place. It looks like copycat of where I was last week. Oh, we must come again. I do like going to that. Of course, that is the change that we have to go through.
So I can remember people in the Environment Agency who I think they were given the task of making sure that even if it rained more in Cumbria, that people didn't get flooded any more than they did in Kent and other places. So that challenge is always there. Our second speaker today is Debbie Simpson, who's the Chief Exec of the Institute for Continuing Improvement in Public Services.